We've spent summers so that our children would get to know their Crimean cousins better, their aunts and uncles, their grandmother, in fact, their great-grandmother. And Crimea is a magical place. In the mornings, typically, I get up with the sun and head out into the hills for a jog. And as the summer sun heats up the Crimean earth, one's hit with the bouquet of wild Crimean grasses. And I'd often stop at this cliff by the seaside to take in the incredible vistas of the Black Sea, of the Crimean Mountains. After a long day at the beach with the kids, we go to visit our grandmother or our great-grandmother for dinner. Typically, a table would be set up under the fruit trees in the yard, laden with fruits, vegetables, chipureki, and other savory Tatar dishes. And as the afternoon would wear on and the sun would begin to set, if the children weren't too loud, we'd hear the haunting sounds of calls to prayer. In a month and a half, a book will be published under the name of This Blessed Land, Crimea and Crimean Tatars, written by Professor Роберт Маґочі. And I'm sure it's that beauty, both natural and cultural, of Crimea that inspired the title of the book, This Blessed Land. But there's also a darker side to Crimea. Something that the world has just become aware of. Often when I speak with Russian Crimeans, you hear derogatory, denigrating comments about Tatars. Or worse, comments such as, they should go back to Central Asia, where they belong. This is Slavic land, Russian land, Orthodox land. Or the worst, we should finish what Stalin didn't complete. After independence, Ukraine, in a gesture of goodwill, a beautiful gesture of goodwill, welcomed back the Crimean Tatars. But then they were left by Kiev to benign neglect. And that void was filled with something a lot more sinister. And today, we're bearing witness to those plans, those dark, evil plans. I remember hearing about these Russian cultural camps, where young boys in the summer would be fed Russian chauvinistic propaganda, cultural camps where they were taught how to use small arms. And then 5 years ago, something peculiar began to happen while we were there. Billboards started springing up on the major highways and then on secondary roads. Billboards of young men, blonde hair, blue eye, and one word, unity. And the backdrop was a stylized Russian imperial eagle in attack mode. And as you drove into Tatar villages, past these billboards, the message was clear. This land would unite with an imperial Russia. It was a land for those with blonde hair and blue eyes. And it would be done through the force of arms. When I looked into Who was funding these hundreds of billboards through Crimea? It was a group no one seemed to really know who they were or where they got their money. Ruski Единство, with a leader that no one really knew a lot about either. His name was Aksyonov, a transplanted Russian Moldovan from Transnistria. It was also that summer, I believe it was 5 years ago, that I first met the head of the Majlis, Mustafa Jamilyev. A man who'd spent 18 years in Soviet prison camps, who'd led his people back to their ancestral homeland. And that year, former President Yushchenko had expelled a number of Russian diplomats from Ukraine for allegedly funding a team of assassins in southern Ukraine who had targeted a number of people, including Mustafa Jamilyev. Some of you might remember, 3 years ago I invited Mustafa Jamilyev to Canada. I took him to Parliament, introduced him in Parliament, and in fact just a kilometer down the road here on Bloor Street at the Ukrainian Art Foundation, there was a community meeting with Mr. Jamilyev. And some people said I was being alarmist then because the posters said Crimea, the next post-Soviet conflict. After that evening with Mr. Jamilyev, I was approached by someone who I'd known and our paths had crossed some 30-odd years ago, Professor Роберт Маґочі. 30-odd years ago, I was the president of the Ukraine Students Club. He was the newly appointed chair of Ukrainian Studies, and I was one of the organizers of boycotts and protests outside of his classes. Who would think that 30 years on, we would become, through this project, a book about Crimea, we become good friends, co-conspirators, and without further ado, I'd like Professor Maဃocsi to come up and talk about this particular project, its importance, its relevance. Professor Maဃocsi, a proud Rusin, and perhaps a historian who has a deeper understanding and knowledge of Ukrainian history and the history of all of Ukraine's people than the vast majority of Ukrainians. Professor Maဃocsi.
Shalom Aleichem. Dobry wieczór. Shalom Aleichem is actually the Crimean Tatar form. You've all come to see a film and not to listen to any more lectures, so I will be brief, but I think it's worth just saying one or two things about the context of Crimean Tatars, and so I'll share with you a very brief text that I shared with my colleagues at the University of Toronto 2 weeks ago at a seminar in which most of the discussion was about Russia and its relationship to Ukraine. We know that in the past few weeks, much of the world's media has told us that Crimea is really a historic Russian land that had only recently become part of Ukraine. In that context, it might be useful to remember just a few basic facts. Crimea was annexed to what was then the Russian Empire in 1783 and remained part of that empire and its Soviet successor state until 1954. That is, and now you can remember the number, 160 years. 160 years. And And we all know that since 1954, Crimea has been part of Ukraine. That is for 60 years. So we have 160 and 60. But the longest period of rule in Crimea was from the mid-15th to late 18th centuries. That is roughly 330 years, when it was part of the Crimean Khanate. Now, the Crimean Khanate was ruled by the ancestors of the Crimean Tatars as a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. It is also important to note that we are speaking specifically about Crimean Tatars. We've already heard tonight the word Tatari. It's not Tatari, Krimskih Tatari. Why? Because there are other related but very distinct Turkic peoples, such as Volga Tatars, Kazan Tatars, a whole host of Tatars. We're talking specifically about Crimean Tatars. So we should be saying Crimean Tatars or Krimskih Tatari. Now, as for the population of Crimea, it was never Russian, nor for that matter even Slavic. Some of you may be a little bit sensitive here, but let's face reality. The age-old farthest extent of Slavic settlement was the Ros River, which is really only about 100 kilometers south of Kiev. This means that Slavs, including Russians, cannot be considered the indigenous inhabitants of the Ukrainian steppe, and certainly not of Crimea. Russians, and to a lesser extent Ukrainians, began to settle in Crimea only from the outset of the 19th century. Therefore, pride of place as the population that has lived longest in Crimea goes to the Crimean Tatars. And so if politicians, journalists, scholarly commentators are obliged to feel they need to make use of sound bites, the appropriate sound bite would be Crimea, the historic land of the Crimean Tatars. There's also some uncertainty about the number of Crimean Tatars in Crimea. In 2001, the last census, there was just over 2 million inhabitants in Crimea. That's all of Crimea. Of whom 243,000, 12%, were Crimean Tatars. It's likely today that their number is about 300,000. But where did these 243,000 or 300,000 come from if we are told that the entire group, about 188,000 at the time, were forcibly and brutally deported on direct orders from Stalin to Soviet Central Asia? That exodus eastward began on what for the Crimean Tatars has ever since been remembered as their Black Day, Karakun, May 18, 1944. And perhaps we should celebrate here in Toronto, or in remembrance, the Karakun on May 18th, which next month will be the 60th anniversary of this ghastly event. And then after languishing for, I'm going to end soon, nearly half a century in Soviet Uzbekistan, the vast majority returned home from exile in the early 1990s, thanks, as we have heard, to the welcoming policy of the government of independent Ukraine. And it is for this reason that Crimean Tatars and their political and civic institutions are fiercely loyal to Ukraine and fear having to live under Russian rule. And if Vladimir Putin's authoritative Russian government is not problematic enough, even worse